we take a look at the issues, challenges, and solutions being discussed for the energy transition and everything that falls into that bucket, of course, of which there are many aspects. Today, we're going to be focusing our discussion on hydrogen and financing for hydrogen solutions as part of the energy transitions. And we're also directing our discussions every week in a slightly shorter term horizon context as we move towards the next COP meeting here in the region in November, and trying to make our discussions a little bit more short term in terms of what countries, what companies are doing to try and meet these net zero targets that they've set for themselves, and of course what impact that has on them, and of course on the whole energy complex. So I'd like to welcome for the first time joining us Mr. Orhan Tenriverdi, who's director at Cranwell Partners based in Istanbul, and Dr. Valentina Dedi, lead economist, consultant international at KBR, and Mr. Oliver Phillips, who has been with us before, Associate Director of Sustainable Finance for MENA at Standard Chartered Bank. So thank you all for joining us. And Orhan, I'd like to invite you to have a look at the recommended sort of headlines that we have provided there, and hopefully you've had a chance to look at those and tell me if any of them grabbed your attention.
Sure, Diala. I mean, all of them are quite interesting topics and maybe a topic for debate on their own. But what struck me most out of those were number 2 and 10. Number 2 is an announcement by Airbus, that they're cooperating together with an Australian mining company towards developing a zero-emission aircraft by 2035. This actually comes at the back of a recent announcement by Airbus. They recently also announced that they started developing a zero-emission combustion engine working on hydrogen, and then they were trying to achieve zero-emission flight by 2035. I mean, considering the whole development cycle of the aviation industry, I think this is an extremely ambitious target. We know that the current focus of the sector is more on syn fuels as a transition towards, let's say, lower emission fuels, rather than focusing on purely on hydrogen because of the technological barriers. Simply, I mean, if you look at the most other use cases of green hydrogen, or the green molecule, so to say, the technology is more or less there. So you need some modifications, some maybe improvement in the efficiencies, but more or less it's there. But this is slightly different for the aviation industry because of direct use of hydrogen requires a significant change in technology, and as such, I think this is quite a groundbreaking news. If this can be achieved within a time horizon of 10-15 years, it will be quite groundbreaking for the whole aviation sector. Then I think also, as I mentioned, number 10, this I think has a slightly different angle. It touches upon the whole development of the green hydrogen ecosystem not becoming a burden on taxpayers, which I think is quite an important topic, because this whole excitement around the green hydrogen as a vector to reaching zero emissions is very positive. We are hearing, I mean, governments announcing new policies, making funds available to new projects. This is all good, but if you look for the healthy evolution of the industry, what's I think absolutely essential is that all of these projects should be economically viable, without which it could be more challenging for the whole industry altogether. Because I mean, we've recently seen in the past decade a similar story in renewable energy, where governments provided lots of support schemes at the beginning for the fostering of the renewable energy projects, which then became too dependent on these, and we've observed that at one point this started quickly becoming a burden on the governments, and at times it reached levels that were not sustainable. So I think the green hydrogen industry should not repeat these mistakes. So it should focus on the economic viability of the projects, obviously, I mean, support from the governments will be essential to kickstart that process in the early years. But there should be the economic viability should be absolute focus of all the projects and the stakeholders.
Yeah, and I mean, to make them commercially viable, obviously you have to bring costs down, and to do that, technology has to continue to be invested into and developed.
Yes.
So the money is still going to have to come into that solution. Now, as you said, governments may have limitations as to how much it can provide, and also for companies not to get used to that. But at the same time, we do need the funds to come from somewhere. So, I mean, thank you, Orhan. I'll go to you, Oliver, on that, just on that point, in terms of the private sector stepping into that, you know, at that space. We've talked about that before on this program, but are we seeing that happening fast enough so that, you know, these solutions like hydrogen, like green, will become commercially viable sooner? And will the private sector step up enough to take that burden off the governments?
Well, I think the first one of those headlines that Orhan had flagged, I think, does show that the private sector is starting to act. You've got a tie up there with Airbus and Fortescue, and I think really, for me, that's what's been potentially missing from sort of accelerating that private sector engagement, which is the offtake piece. At the moment, we've got lots of people, lots of different institutions saying we want to produce hydrogen, and others saying, well, yes, we know we're going to want hydrogen at some point, but there's not been as much that sort of kind of clear and concrete demand that you can point to. But here we've got an example of sort of both elements coming together, the supply and the demand side. And I think really for the private sector, particularly when you look at kind of when it comes to finance and the kind of the commercial banking, private financing space rather than the development financing space or multilateral financing, it's going to be that is the key catalyst. Once we start seeing that not only do we have these great projects and a lot of really exciting ones happening all over the world, but particularly in the Middle East where there's a lot of action and a lot of kind of dialogue around this. But once we see that and we then start to see the offtakes and the demand bits starting to take shape and starting to be more kind of contextualized, that's going to actually help to bring the private sector in and help move us along at the speed that does need to be accelerated to get there.
Yeah, Dr. Valentino, I mean, on that point of off-takers and having the demand pull, if you like, to bring in the investment at the other end, the demand guarantee, this region where you've recently moved to, you know, has arguably quite a few sort of hard to abate you know, indigenous sectors that could make use of, you know, ammonia, which is produced from hydrogen, etc. That is not happening yet necessarily in volume, but I mean, like Oliver said and pointed out, there's several projects and private-public partnerships also being signed and initiatives in this region to use hydrogen going forward. But again, how important is that off-taker argument, and how developed is it so far? How far down the road are we where that's going to get to a point where investors are going to feel secure about what they're putting in?
Yeah, thanks. Because this is really a very important question and a very critical one. And I fully agree with Oliver at the moment. We have an issue when it comes to the end market at the moment. And it is quite obvious, actually. If you just have a look, just go online and check all these publications about the hydrogen outlook at the moment. Out to 2050, you will see that not only the volumes of demand levels vary significantly across these different sources, but also the perspectives when it comes to the role that hydrogen can play across the end-use applications. So this actually creates lots of uncertainty for investors, because they cannot really understand what the scale of opportunity will be. Of course, there will be demand, but they don't really know it. And of course, some might argue that, you know, okay, investors have some kind of familiarity, or they are used to a certain degree of uncertainty. Yes, this is true, but we should not forget that at the moment we really have a big size of challenge in front of us, and actually the speed with which decisions need to be made at the moment, because we keep saying and we keep hearing that we need to act, and we need to act now and really fast in order to get on track for our net zero goal by 2050. So actually, we need to provide this confidence to the investors, right, that there will be demand. And And in addition to that, we need also to make sure, and I think Orhan discussed it at the beginning, is that we need to make sure that we create sustainable markets, right? Because we need to make sure that all these new technologies, they can compete in their own merit. And if I can add something from the experience that I have seen, with a number of discussions and engagement that we have with different stakeholders at the moment, because we are working a lot on energy transition at KBR. The feedback that actually we get at the moment is that they have a bit of confusion. They don't really know where demand will come from. And it happened very recently, actually, I was speaking to some technology providers, and they were like, we are ready, but where is the market? Where is demand coming from? And this is really important. And this is where actually government can play a key role by creating not only the policies, and it's all good that we are hearing about all these financial commitments, although again, there is a big question mark here, right? When you read about these big sums, you still are not sure where this money will come from. Does it involve some private investment as well? How are these calculations being done? And they need also to create this revenue certainty. So for investors, in order to go out there and invest in something, they need to make sure that they have a really clear financial structure in front of them.
Yeah, I mean, as you said, our policy is very important, and direction and clarity on that policy. Orhan, back to you. And one of those, if you look at across the global picture, if you like, if we're going to eventually have a global hydrogen market, which is obviously the idea. I mean, you can have these localized tie-ups and partnerships. At the end of the day, this is going to be being produced somewhere and exported to somewhere else. How important is the carbon credits market and the whole, the pricing of carbon and offsets in that sense? How critical is it that we reach an agreement on that globally for, let alone for other more advanced technologies that we already have and available energies, but for hydrogen, which green hydrogen, which is yet to be commercially viable, how important is having an established carbon market a trigger to incentivizing this investment further? Oh, you're on mute, Orhan. Sorry.
No, I mean, it will definitely be an enabler, and it's a critical element for the development of the industry. I mean, without a meaningful differentiation of the green molecule from the rest, at the end of the day, hydrogen is hydrogen, and it's either a vector for energy or it's a raw material that is used within the process. What makes, let's say, blue or green hydrogen different from the molecule itself? It's this differentiation on the carbon emission part. And as long as you don't have a standardized way of valuing that contribution, it becomes difficult for green hydrogen or blue hydrogen to compete or to stand out from the rest. And having this tax at carbon tax at borders, that is actually a way or a pathway of achieving this standardization, and it will be very critical for valuing the CO2 component of the total price and making green hydrogen become more competitive and more economically viable. And also, another point maybe worth mentioning, what we see, especially in some of the states, the whole ambition or the focus around green hydrogen itself is focusing either on green hydrogen or ammonia itself, rather than focusing more on the end product, which should be the decarbonization of the industries. So what we hear quite often is that countries are trying to become a player in the newly emerging green hydrogen market, announcing new projects, trying to get a piece of the pie. But what is lacking, as I mentioned, is their strategy in developing a decarbonization of the local industries and how they can actually become part of the global decarbonized economy.
And are you seeing any regions or sectors even which are doing more on that front than others, or certain countries that are actually pushing policy towards helping these sectors decarbonize, or not, but let's compare the Gulf with Europe. I mean, we know Europe is way ahead of the game, so let's compare.
Yes.
Let's look at the Middle East and have a talk about that.
Yes, I think that is one part is a bit lacking in the Middle East. Yes, there is the focus, as I mentioned, is more on building a green hydrogen ecosystem and become a green hydrogen exporter rather than being
Indigenous.
focusing that the end user. A bit maybe what we are seeing in the region a bit more focus on the mobility side. That is an end use where there is a bit of focus. But other than that, I mean, we believe that the Gulf states can actually extract more value by focusing or developing strategies for the end products, which can then be exported to Europe and create more value for the locals, for the local economies.
Oliver, just to go on the sort of look at the banking, the capital markets, and sort of look at the financial sector itself and how it views any transition, whether it's hydrogen or not, but we're talking about hydrogen today, but the climate risks into sort of security prices. I mean, we've had this discussion before, and we've had and a whole energy transition story has had a boost during COVID in that sense. Now, of course, we have a particular other crisis on our hands, which is again, focusing everyone's attentions on conventional energy supplies and making sure those stay around. But again, how much are banks factoring in sort of climate risk into security prices, into the products that they're selling, if you like? Is that entrenched?
I think it's not quite fully entrenched, but it is becoming entrenched. We've started to see a number of the regulators actually coming out with their stress tests that are linked to climate. So the Bank of England started this. They've just announced round 2, their second round of the stress test. We've seen a number of others, Monetary Authority of Singapore, HKMA in Hong Kong, also starting to kind of look at this, and the likelihood is that we'll see something coming out of the US sooner rather than later. But there's still a long way to go from looking at the stress test, which is effectively saying, okay, what would happen under certain climate scenarios to my overall portfolio, to actually having climate become a part of credit. And there's still a long way to go on that, I think, but people have realized they need to. We're seeing when we look at credit ratings provided by the likes of Moody's and Standard & Poor's that they're now introducing an ESG section to that, but still the ESG section is delinked from the overall score. So we haven't seen the kind of direct crossover there, but it's at least in the same document, which is a positive step forward. So we're going to see this, but it's how long it's going to take is going to be what distinguishes it. But I think banks are starting to realize that ourselves in our latest annual results, we realized that our green and sustainable portfolio was actually better returning from a return on RWA point of view than our overall conventional book. Things like that start to point you.
And green bonds. I mean, I think I haven't heard a lot of those announced recently, but there was a period in the last 5 years where that was, as you said, as part of the whole ESG sort of focus. What are the pitfalls of the green bond market? I mean, what needs to be done there to encourage more usage of those and more uptake?
If you look at what happened last year, I mean, we had a phenomenal result where green bonds came to around about the $1 trillion mark, increased their overall share in the total bond markets. And what was interesting is that the growth in green bonds wasn't the same as the growth in the total bond market. So it was the share of green bonds increasing in a relative kind of point of view. Now, obviously, this year, the bond markets have been through a few disruptions pre the crisis that's obviously going on at the moment. We had disruptions in the rates market due to the uncertainty around where the Fed is going to go. And that's meant that it's not been the most sort of welcome environment for issuers. But we have seen deals in the region. We saw Riyadh Bank, one of the Saudi kind of banking champions, come out with what ended up being the world's first ever sustainable AT1 issuance in Sukuk format. Standard Chartered was one of the ESG coordinators on that deal, and great to be part of it. So we definitely see that environment. And what we see is that even though the bonds aren't being issued, a lot of would-be issuers are spending the time now to actually put in place their sustainable finance frameworks so that when the market is in the right space, they're ready to go. So there's a whole pent-up kind of supply of ESG issuances that is waiting to come once we've got an environment where rates make sense, the volatility is less, and actually for any issuer, green or non-green, it becomes an attractive window.
Dr. Valentina, an issue that we often talk about across other products in the sector is the cooperation between, the three areas of government, private sector, industry, and academia, if you like, the R&D side of this equation. Do you identify that there's enough cooperation amongst those three bodies, and is there a need for that for hydrogen to kind of progress, to progress and to have investment pour into it? Do we need to see more cooperation between those three arms?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, that's really simple to answer. That there should be collaboration and cooperation because, as I said, we have this urgency, we have this big challenge. And although hydrogen is not something new, it has a really long history. We are still trying to explore the behavior of hydrogen following, for example, its releasing to a certain temperature or certain environments, or find out its explosion properties or its operating conditions across the end-use applications. So there are still many things we need to find out about hydrogen. And at the same time, what we are trying to do is to have this scale up of the hydrogen economy at the same time, right? So we understand that there is a knowledge gap here that we need to fill, and we need to close that. And I think we are on the right direction, because if you look at all these announcements, and I think we have some of them, we have a few examples in the news digest of today's discussion.
Sorry.
Yeah, it is happening. So you see an ever increasing collaboration and cooperation between different stakeholders. And when I say different, it's not only the number of stakeholders that are coming together, but it's also the fact that they are coming from different backgrounds. So you will see, for example, energy companies, you will see technology providers or research institutions or model developers. They are all coming together, and this diversity really helps. Of course, you can still argue that, okay, you can see these joint partnerships maybe in very limited geographical locations or clusters, if you want, because we have been using this this word a lot. And this is, when the interests or the objectives are really aligned between the different parties. Yeah, it is true, it is happening. And it might be becoming more challenging on a national level, but yeah, still there is opportunity, for the government to step up and maybe, take this coordination role, maybe using a link to the national hydrogen strategy, right? And try to facilitate this knowledge sharing across the different parties when the objectives or the interests are not really fully aligned. So yeah,
knowledge sharing, again, that applies across countries to the extent there's always this argument that let's not double up on our efforts and R&D, and let's cross over on what we're all doing, and sort of try not to repeat, I suppose, the investment or R&D that's going on. Orhan, just back to you on just zeroing in a bit on COP27. It's happening here in the region in November at the end of this year, and the year after we're in the UAE as well. So the region broadly is going to be focused, the center of focus for the COP meetings the next 2 years. Do you think that makes a difference to initiatives being taken by countries in this part of the world? I mean, whether it's on hydrogen or others, will it pour more money into initiatives happening here or not? What impact will come? And secondly, we came out of COP26 with a lot of conclusions, one of which was not enough money is still being given to developing emerging markets to help them on this energy transition route. Should we be focusing more on that before we get on to the whole hydrogen equation?
Let me start from your second question, maybe. Certainly, I mean, the funding is an absolutely important element within these projects and within the green hydrogen space. And yes, I mean, there needs to be funds made available. But what we see is the appetite is there. I mean, yes, Oliver was mentioning, I mean, we were looking at the rate hikes expected from Fed, which the whole unclarity around that. and etc. But what we still see that there is ample liquidity looking for investments, and this whole green economy is at the forefront or at the central part of it. So there is a lot of, both on the private investors and also on the lender side, we see the liquidity is there. What's maybe more lacking is the well-defined investment opportunities, because I mean we've talked about certain important elements like the offtake. In that regard, I think the demand is there. The project will not have an issue with demand in the short to medium term. But what's more important is how to structure those offtakes, so to have a, let's say, more of a bankable structure, and what ideally you need is a portfolio of off-takers, and try to structure it in such a way that it resembles the market dynamics as much as possible without deviating too much from the economic underlying reasons. Then the second topic, which I think you were mentioning, is the EPC part, or the competitiveness of the projects, which is becoming inherently more difficult at the back of the whole disruptive inflation all around the world. But what is maybe neglected, those two are definitely very important, but what we see is quite often neglected is the midstream story to all of these projects. I mean, transmission and storage is an absolutely critical part of the whole equation. And when you look at most of the projects, or when you speak to stakeholders, investors, this topic does not come up that often. So to be able to have this well-defined project, you need to have the investors focusing on each of these elements, having a coherent story, and only then you will be able to realize these projects. So,
and of course the storage question is still a challenge with renewables. You know, the whole the intermittency, the storage, even the distribution, and in certain countries and certain regions, which is being invested to, but again, solutions are still lacking there. Orhan, you brought up a point that I want to put to Oliver, perhaps as a closing thought from him, which is the situation we're facing now today. You know, who would have thought 2-3 months ago that we would be in this situation? You know, we've had COVID, and then we had economies recovering much more quickly than expected, including energy prices. Banks have had super successful year last year, but again, Oliver, you know, given the risks that banks and the finance sector face now with, you know, with inflation, and then with global recession perhaps around the corner, and with the whole turmoil that the war in Ukraine is triggering, and the whole commodities complex exploding, do you think there'll be a bit of caution from the finance sector now? Let's step back. Let's, you know, green hydrogen is certainly not a priority. Let's switch back to, you know, where we need to be focusing our interest and protecting ourselves. Do you think that this current crisis is going to deviate us from on this journey?
I think we're at a point where we've gone over the tipping point. The finance sector has moved so far beyond the kind of the status quo to this new world where banks are setting net zero commitments for their financing. Standard Chartered has said 2050 we're going to be net zero from our financing. We can't just sit back and say, okay, we're going to go back and finance gas, we're going to finance oil, we're definitely not going to go back to coal ever again. So I don't think we're going to see that. I think we're going to see an acceleration of more projects that are being financed that are in renewables. Not least because also when you look at what the developers are wanting to do, they're not wanting to do coal and oil and gas anymore. They want to do renewables. That's where they see the growth. That's where they see these assets being long-term assets that continue generating value. We haven't mentioned it today, but the risk of stranded assets is a huge problem. Yeah. So even though in the next 2 or 3 years, there may be some kind of disruptions from oil at 130 plus, or wherever it ends up at over the next couple of weeks, in the kind of that sort of 5 to 10 year space, it's going to be renewables, it's going to be hydrogen that takes center stage.
Yeah, and of course, how the whole accounting is done around those stranded assets has always been a question. Dr. Valentina, I'll let you have the last word today and put it to you to give us your, which is sometimes a question we ask all our panelists, but I'll ask you, on your wish list, let's say, if you have to name your next top step that needs to be taken to push this hydrogen story forward and financing into it, what would be the next step that needs to be taken on top of the list?
Well, yeah, I think we pretty much covered, the key points, although we would need hours, to really have a full discussion about them. But I'll just come back, to two key words that actually Orhan mentioned about carbon intensity. And just, if we can take it, just to have a think about it, because everyone at the moment seems to discuss about the colors of hydrogen, right? Green, blue, or pink, or I don't know what those would be. What if we just forget about the colors of hydrogen and we just focus on the carbon intensity? Because what we want actually to achieve right now is to take carbon out of the atmosphere, right? We want to get the balance right. Eventually, we will get to green hydrogen. There is no question about it. But at the moment, why we don't give this flexibility to producers and to stakeholders and to markets actually to act, to work on their own, and we will get there. So I'll leave it, with this thing. And as I said, for me, it's about demand at the moment. We would like to get a bit more clarity when it comes to demand and where demand will come from, and then greater collaboration between governments and private sector, because at the moment, from clients that we have and we are working with them, collaborating with them, I can see that they get really confused where the demand will come from. And I'll tell you why, because when they do all these techno-economic studies and feasibility studies to try to identify the areas they need to invest, they should invest actually, most of the times you will see that the findings of those studies show a different direction to what policies are showing. And this is really critical, and we need to address that, and we need to address it as soon as possible.
Yeah. Okay. And yeah. So clarity from policymakers really to make that very evident where they're directing as well. As you said, the consumer side, I think the efficiency, the carbon, whole carbon efficiency argument also is very much part of it. And of course, this region's done a lot on the sequestration front as well for carbon. So. In parallel to investing in hydrogen as well. But thank you very much. I'm afraid we've run out of time very quickly. To Dr. Valentina and to Orhan from Istanbul and Oliver, thank you very much, everybody. And thank you to our viewers for joining us. We'll see you again.
Have a good one.
Thank you.